When I opened my front door that Thursday morning and found another envelope with no postage, no return address, and my name scribbled in cheap ink, I knew exactly who it was from. Dolores Jennings, the self-appointed queen of our HOA and the reason I started drinking decaf again. I bent down, picked it up, and sighed. The last time Dolores slipped something under my door, it was a citation about how my trash bins were left out longer than the community standard of 90 minutes. A number, of course, she made up on the spot. I tore the envelope open right there in the doorway. Inside was a typed invoice for $475, allegedly for emergency tree limb removal, which was wild, considering I hadn't had a single branch trimmed, let alone removed. My front yard tree was a healthy maple that hadn't dropped a limb in years. I called out to my dog. Guess Karen's at it again. His tail wagged. He liked her about as much as I did, which is to say, not at all. I'm Yarden Price, software engineer by day, and lately, amateur legal researcher by night. I bought my house in this Charlotte suburb 5 years ago. It was quiet, affordable, and had a decent school nearby for my daughter, Grace. Everything was perfect, until Dolores ran for HOA president and won by default. No one else ran. No one else wanted to. Dolores is the kind of middle-aged woman who wears oversized sunglasses even at dusk and speaks like she's narrating a cooking show. She runs the HOA like a dictatorship, handing out fines for grass height and aesthetically disruptive doormats. She has a clipboard, a megaphone, and zero shame. I walked out onto my porch, invoice in hand, and spotted her right on cue marching down the sidewalk in her floral blouse and wedge sandals, clipboard clutched like a Bible. Her mouth twitched when she saw me holding the paper. "Good morning, Mr. Price," she chirped. "I trust you received the invoice?" I raised an eyebrow. "Yeah, I did. Want to tell me why I'm being charged for a tree limb that never existed?" She blinked. "Oh, but it did. Last week. Fell onto the sidewalk. I had it removed to prevent a hazard. The HOA cannot risk liability." I nodded slowly. "You got pictures of this dangerous limb?" "I don't need to provide evidence for emergency services," she said, her smile tight and fake. "The HOA bylaws grant me emergency powers to act swiftly in the community's best interest." "Emergency powers?" I laughed. "What are you, the governor of Pine Hollow Estates?" Her eyes narrowed. "You have 30 days to remit payment, or interest will accrue at 1.5% monthly." She turned and walked off before I could say another word. Now, here's the thing. I'd already had my suspicions about Dolores. A few neighbors had mentioned strange charges or fines with no documentation. One guy down the street paid over $1,000 for mailbox compliance. Another was cited for excessive driveway wear. I decided it was time to dig deeper. That night, after Grace went to bed, I pulled out the HOA bylaws. I had scanned the whole 112-page PDF last year when she tried to find me for my Halloween decorations. I remembered something about emergency maintenance, but it required a vote from at least 2 board members. Dolores was the president. But the other 2 seats? Vacant. No one had stepped up and she never pushed for replacements. Classic power grab. I printed the invoice and took a red Sharpie to it. Fraudulent across the top. The next day, I visited my neighbor, Gary, nicest retired firefighter you'll ever meet. His house has a clear view of my front yard from his porch. "Gary," I asked, "you see any tree limbs fall from my maple last week?" He shook his head without hesitation. "Not a single twig. I sit out there every morning. Dolores is making stuff up again." "Looks like it." I told him about the invoice. "You should set up a camera," he said. "Catch her in the act. She's got no idea how many people are fed up." On my way back home, I passed Dolores again. She gave me a wide smile. "Tick-tock, Yarden," she said. "Don't ignore a legal notice." "Don't worry," I said. "I'm not ignoring anything. In fact, I'm documenting everything." She paused, the corner of her smile twitching. "Is that meant to be a threat?" "Nope," I said. "It's a promise." That weekend, I installed a Ring camera above my front door and 2 motion-activated cameras on both sides of my lot. I also started asking around, quietly. Just a few neighbors at a time, ones I trusted. Turns out Dolores had been sending out all kinds of handwritten invoices. No receipts, no signatures, no board approval. Just her, a printer, and a stack of HOA letterhead paper. One neighbor, Dana, had an invoice for public sidewalk power wash, $210. Another, a vet named Marcus, was billed for unauthorized grill visibility. I didn't even know grills could be unauthorized. I collected copies, scanned them, labeled them, all signed HOA President Dolores Jennings. All with no photo evidence, no contractor names, nothing. Then came the kicker. One neighbor, Paula, had refused to pay for a community pest inspection that never happened. Weeks later, she found her mailbox knocked over. No witnesses, no footage. But Dolores had warned her about non-compliance the day before. Things were escalating and people were scared. I decided it was time to go full throttle. I filed a formal complaint with the county's Department of Consumer Affairs. I submitted copies of the fake invoices, the HOA bylaws, and a list of vacant board seats. I also included a timeline and a list of neighbors willing to testify. The agent I spoke to, Mr. Ramos, sounded intrigued. You're saying she billed residents for services that never occurred? Correct, I said. And she's representing herself as acting on behalf of the HOA, which she's running solo. He paused. That's fraud. If she used HOA funds or letterhead to issue those invoices, that's criminal fraud. Exactly, I said. A week later, an investigator reached out. He wanted to meet with me and a few neighbors. We gathered in my garage. I had everything laid out. Invoices, HOA documents, video footage, and a few brave souls ready to talk. Gary spoke first. We didn't vote on any of this. No meetings, no notices. She just does whatever she wants. Dana added, I asked her once for a receipt and she told me I didn't need one. That's not how this works. By the time we were done, the investigator had a folder an inch thick. She's going to regret putting her signature on all of these, he said. But Dolores didn't know any of this was happening, not yet. So when she slipped another envelope under my door the next week, this time for a late fee processing charge, I didn't get mad. I smiled. I picked it up, scanned it, filed it, and added it to the growing stack of evidence labeled HOA Fraud Jennings. She had no idea the trial was coming. But it was. And it was going to be public, loud, and expensive. The morning after Dolores dropped off the latest bogus fee, I drove to the county clerk's office with a folder full of damning paperwork and a flash drive loaded with video clips and audio recordings. The investigator, Andre Voss, had already begun his internal review, but I wanted the civil side of this locked down too. I requested a copy of the HOA's incorporation documents and bylaws as filed with the state. What I got back confirmed what I'd suspected. The HOA's legal status as a nonprofit corporation had lapsed 2 years ago due to failure to file annual reports. Dolores Jennings was operating an unregistered, technically defunct HOA while collecting fines, issuing invoices, and impersonating legal authority. That was more than just unethical, it was illegal. Do you want me to flag this for the Attorney General's office? The clerk asked, glancing over the documents. I already sent a report to Consumer Affairs, I said. But if this gets to the AG faster, by all means, flag away. I spent the rest of the day compiling everything into a digital folder I named Operation Overthrow. I included timestamps, testimony from neighbors, and a spreadsheet tracking every invoice I'd collected. After cross-referencing dates, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. Over half of the charges coincided with the HOA's quarterly dues deadlines. It was like clockwork. People who didn't pay dues immediately were punished with fake service charges that conveniently added up to just enough to justify a lien if unpaid. That night, I called a friend from college, Asha Patel, now a civil litigation attorney in Raleigh. I laid everything out. The fake fees, the lapsed registration, the vacant board seats, She's issuing financial penalties under the guise of a legal entity that technically doesn't exist, Asha said. That's fraud and potentially racketeering if she used the mail or electronic systems to do it. Has she filed any liens? 2 that I know of, I said. And she's threatened more. Then someone needs to file for injunctive relief and possibly damages, she said. You've got a solid case. If you want, I can draft a cease and desist pro bono. Can you make it look terrifying? I'll throw in some Latin. Judges eat that up. By Monday morning, I had the cease and desist in hand. It was printed on thick, cream-colored legal stock and addressed formally to Dolores Jennings, acting as Pine Hollow HOA president. I dropped it off at her doorstep just before sunrise, folding it neatly into a manila envelope and sliding it between her storm door and frame. By noon, she was pounding on my front door like a repo agent. You're going to regret this, she snapped the moment I opened it. You think you can intimidate me with empty threats and bogus documents? I tilted my head. You mean the ones that cite the exact statute your fake invoices violate? I'm within my rights, she blurted, waving the envelope. The HOA grants me discretionary authority. No, Dolores, I interrupted. The HOA doesn't grant you anything. It doesn't exist. You let the registration lapse 2 years ago. You're not a president. You're a woman with a clipboard and a printer. Her jaw clenched. I won't be spoken to that way in my own neighborhood. You mean the one where you've been pretending to run a government? She turned and stormed off without another word. I closed the door knowing she was about to panic behind the scenes. By Thursday, the fallout began. 2 sheriff's deputies arrived at her house around lunchtime. I saw them from my office window, one standing at the door, the other speaking into a radio. A few minutes later, Dolores came out clutching a disheveled stack of papers. She tried to argue, but the deputy calmly handed her a document, then gestured toward their cruiser. She didn't get arrested, not yet, but they took statements and left with a cardboard box from her garage. Word spread fast. By dinner time, neighbors were knocking on my door, asking what happened. I told them the truth without embellishment and offered to share the documents I'd collected. Most were stunned. A few were angry at themselves for not questioning her sooner. She fined me for having a bird feeder, said old man Reggie from 2 doors down. Said it invited squirrels. I paid it because I didn't want trouble. I should have known. She tried to tell me my solar panels were aesthetic pollutants, said a young couple from the corner house. We thought about moving. I invited them all to a Saturday meeting in my garage. Not a protest. Not a mob. Just information. That Saturday, 21 residents showed up. I had folding chairs, a whiteboard, and a pot of coffee. Gary brought donuts. I walked everyone through the timeline, the evidence, and the legal path forward. The HOA as it stands doesn't exist. It's not registered with the state. That means all fines, all fees, all enforcement, it's all baseless. Some of us have been extorted. Some have had liens placed on their homes. Those are serious violations of state law. What can we do? Asked Dana, arms folded. We can file a class action suit, I said. And we can petition for a complete reset. New board. New bylaws. Real transparency. Marcus raised his hand. What about criminal charges? There's already an investigation underway, I said. And I've been told the DA's office is reviewing the evidence. I handed out packets with instructions on how to submit affidavits and copies of their own documents. Every person in that garage signed the petition to dissolve the current HOA structure and call for a rechartering under new leadership. The following week, things moved fast. A reporter from the local ABC affiliate showed up on my porch holding a microphone and asking for a statement. I gave her 5 minutes and a copy of the cease and desist. That night, the segment aired under the title, Homeowners Say HOA President Fabricated Fines, Pocketed Fees. The footage included blurred invoices, neighbor interviews, and a shot of Dolores closing her blinds when the cameraman approached. The next morning, the sheriff's office returned, this time with a warrant. They carried out Dolores's desktop computer, a filing cabinet, and several cardboard boxes. This time, they didn't leave without her. She was booked on multiple counts of fraud, misuse of funds, and filing false liens. The charges were serious enough that she was denied immediate bail. The community was stunned, But no one was surprised. That night, I stood in my driveway watching as neighbors lit up their porches and talked openly for the first time in months. It was like someone had lifted a fog. Without the fear of sudden fines or retaliatory inspections, people actually stopped to chat again. I got a call from Andre Voss, the investigator. "It's official," he said. "The DA is proceeding with felony charges. Looks like she funneled at least $26,000 into a personal account over 3 years. Any chance the homeowners get their money back? There's a restitution hearing scheduled. Her assets are frozen until then. And the HOA? Technically dissolved. But if your group wants to wreck harder under legal compliance, the county's willing to help." I thanked him and hung up. A few days later, I got a letter in the mail, not an envelope slipped under the door, but a real one with postage and a return address. It was from the county clerk. Inside was a confirmation that our petition to reestablish the HOA with a new interim board had been approved. We weren't just free of Dolores. We were in charge now. The courtroom was quieter than I expected. Cold fluorescence bounced off polished wood panels, and the only sound was a bailiff flipping through papers. It had been 3 weeks since Dolores Jennings was taken into custody, and today was her preliminary hearing. I sat 3 rows back, surrounded by a small cluster of neighbors who had shown up in quiet solidarity. Gary wore a charcoal suit that looked like it hadn't seen daylight since the Clinton administration. Dana clutched a legal pad like it was the last shield she had left. Asha Patel, my friend and now our community's unofficial legal guardian angel, sat beside me, scanning the docket like she was born for it. Her confidence was steady, but her eyes were sharp. "They're charging her with 6 counts of fraud and 1 count of criminal impersonation," she said under her breath, tapping the docket. "But it's the financial misconduct that's going to sting." The judge entered, an older man with a sharp widow's peak and an expression carved from concrete. He adjusted his glasses and called the session to order. Dolores shuffled in from a side door, wrists cuffed, wearing a navy blouse and beige slacks that looked like they'd been ironed by a sleep-deprived public defender. She glanced around the room, her gaze briefly locking with mine. Her eyes didn't hold the usual venom. They held something closer to disbelief. The prosecution's opening was clinical. They outlined her use of HOA letterhead to issue unauthorized invoices, her manipulation of homeowners into paying fake fines, and most damning, the accounts where those funds had quietly landed. She didn't just fake fines. She laundered the money through a shell landscaping business registered under her nephew's name. The business had never actually performed a single service, but it had issued invoices to the HOA which she paid out with collected dues. The scam was circular, and it had lasted nearly 3 years. The prosecutor laid out the timeline with unnerving precision. The fake landscaping company, called Evergreen Solutions, had 1 bank account which Dolores controlled. Checks from residents were deposited directly, sometimes with the memo line reading things like weed control or storm debris. The total amount siphoned? Just over $32,000. Asha leaned over and whispered, "That bumps this up to grand larceny. She's going to see real time." But the real shock came when the prosecutor introduced a new witness, a former city clerk named Shonda Murray. She'd worked in the zoning office 2 years prior and had received multiple complaints from residents in our neighborhood, complaints Dolores had intercepted by forging letters from the city telling people their concerns were outside jurisdiction. Shonda had come forward after seeing the news segment. She had copies. The forged city letters were signed with the fake name, R. Caldwell, Senior Code Liaison. There was no R. Caldwell in the zoning department. Never had been. The judge raised an eyebrow. "Are you suggesting the defendant impersonated a municipal authority to silence complaints?" "Yes, Your Honor," the prosecutor said. "And we have handwriting analysis confirming that the signature matches documents submitted under Ms. Jennings' name." Dolores's attorney, a thin man with a perpetual frown and a tie 2 inches too wide, stood to object, but the damage was done. The judge permitted the evidence to be entered into the record. After the hearing adjourned, I stepped outside with Asha and the others. The sun was out, but no one seemed to notice. Everyone's focus was on what this meant for the neighborhood moving forward. "She's not just a busybody with a clipboard anymore," Dana said. "She's a felon. She forged city documents," Gary muttered. "That's a whole different category of crazy." "Not crazy," Asha corrected. "Calculated. She knew exactly what she was doing. She just underestimated the people she was doing it to." Over the next few weeks, things started shifting. The interim HOA board, made up of 5 elected neighbors, met for the first time inside the community center that had been locked for nearly a year. Turns out Dolores had changed the locks and claimed the facility was under renovation. The only renovations she'd made were to the filing cabinets, which had been emptied. We found out from a locksmith that the place had been accessed just 3 days before her arrest. Inside, we discovered a locked drawer behind the reception desk. Asha got a court order to access it. What we found inside dropped everyone's jaws. There were copies of every invoice she'd ever sent, including some we'd never seen before. One was addressed to a woman named Lila Thompson, who had moved out of the neighborhood 2 years ago. The invoice, dated after her departure, was for fence obstruction. Another was for a non-regulation wreath during a holiday season that didn't exist, Spring Harvest Day. But the worst was a manila envelope labeled Board Replacement Strategy. Inside were typed notes indicating she had planned to appoint 2 friendly residents to the empty board seats, names listed with dollar amounts next to them. She hadn't gotten around to it, but the intent was crystal clear. She wanted a rubber stamp board so she could pass rules unchallenged. Marcus, reviewing the documents with us, muttered, "She was building a puppet regime." "I'd laugh if it weren't terrifying," Asha said. We submitted the contents of the locked drawer to the DA's office. Within a week, 3 new charges were added to her case, 2 for attempted bribery and 1 for falsifying government correspondence. The trial date was set for 6 weeks later. By then, the neighborhood had transformed. Front yards were alive again. People were repainting shutters, planting flowers, and chatting across driveways. The paranoia had lifted. We set up a community suggestion box in the now accessible clubhouse and hosted a candidate night for the permanent HOA board elections. Every chair was filled. People who had never spoken publicly before stood up and shared ideas. At one point, a woman named Teresa Riley, who'd lived here for over a decade, raised her hand and said, "I used to be afraid to put wind chimes on my porch. I'm not anymore." That's what this means. On the day of the trial, the courtroom was standing room only. Dolores entered wearing a tailored suit, her hair pulled back tight, face pale but composed. She didn't speak during the opening statements. Her attorney tried to frame this situation as mismanagement rather than malice. He argued that she had stepped up in a time of leadership vacuum and made administrative mistakes under pressure. But the prosecution had receipts, literally. Printed bank statements, forged signatures, and testimony from residents who had been harassed, fined, and threatened. The jury barely looked at Dolores by the time closing arguments wrapped. After 2 days of testimony and 6 hours of deliberation, the verdict was unanimous. Guilty on all counts. The judge didn't delay sentencing. Dolores received 6 years in prison with eligibility for parole after 3. She was also ordered to pay full restitution to every resident who had been fined, invoiced, or had liens placed on their property. The state seized assets from her personal account and the Evergreen Solutions shell company to cover the repayments. As she was led from the courtroom, Dolores didn't look at me. She didn't look at anyone. Outside, the mood was electric. We had stood up to a bully with a clipboard and uncovered a criminal with a plan. And we hadn't just survived it, we'd rebuilt. Later that week, I stood in front of the newly reopened community center as people arrived for the first official meeting of the new HOA. Real elections, real transparency. No more envelopes under doors. Gary walked past with a grin and a clipboard of his own. "This time," he said, "we're keeping receipts." The first official meeting of the reformed Pine Hollow board was held under a sky thick with Carolina humidity and the kind of quiet anticipation reserved for courtroom verdicts and championship games. Rows of metal folding chairs stretched across the clubhouse rec room, and every single one was filled. The windows were open, not for ventilation, but because no one wanted a door between them and the truth anymore. The new board, 5 neighbors elected unanimously just 2 weeks earlier, sat at the folding table draped in a plain blue cloth. No banners, no pretense, just clipboards, bottled water, and an agenda that didn't include weaponized fines or invented holidays. I stood near the back, not because I was avoiding the front, but because I wanted to see every face when the meeting truly began, not the polite head nods or awkward half-smiles, but the moment people realized they finally had control over their own neighborhood again. The first item on the agenda was restitution. Not the legal part that was already in motion thanks to the court ruling, but community restitution. The board had reviewed the seized funds, which had been returned in full to a trust account. Every resident who had paid a fraudulent fee or fine would receive a check within the month. The board had hired an independent accounting firm to verify each case. When that was announced, there was no applause. Just a long, collective breath, the kind of silence that comes when people realize they've been holding tension in their chests for years. After the meeting, I stepped outside to find Asha standing by the flagpole near the parking lot, arms crossed, watching the horizon like she was waiting for one last trick to jump out of the bushes. "She's appealing," she said without looking at me. I leaned against the pole, the metal warm from the sun. "Let me guess, on the grounds that she was under psychological distress?" Asha shook her head. "Nope. She's claiming procedural irregularities in the HOA's enforcement powers. Trying to argue that the board's inactivity made her actions legally ambiguous. That's bold for someone who forged zoning letters. She's playing for a reduced sentence. Her lawyer's asking the court to consider the unique pressures of grassroots governance." "You're kidding." "I wish. But the DA's not worried. They've got more than enough to hold the conviction." I glanced back at the clubhouse. "No one in there's going back to sleep on this." "I know," Asha said. "But I wouldn't relax just yet." I didn't. Not for weeks. Even after restitution checks started arriving with certified envelopes and stamped signatures. Even after the county tax office confirmed that every lien Dolores had filed was voided and expunged. It wasn't until the mailbox incident that I realized the story wasn't quite over. It happened just before dusk on a Thursday. I was watering the front hedge, Grace playing hopscotch on the sidewalk, when I noticed a man in a gray hoodie crouching near the community bulletin board at the entrance of the subdivision. I wouldn't have thought twice, except there hadn't been a bulletin there since Dolores tore down the last one for unauthorized flyer layering. I walked over. Before I said anything, he stood and turned mid-30s, thinning hair, clipboard in hand. Something about his stillness unsettled me. "You live here?" he asked. "Yeah." "You?" "Soon." He handed me a folded sheet of paper. "I'm with a management firm. We're advising communities on compliance updates. Your HOA's probably due for a structural audit." I unfolded the sheet. It had a logo I didn't recognize and a website that ended in .biz. No phone number. No address. "Your name?" I asked. He hesitated. "Mike. Last name. Does it matter?" I tucked the flyer into my pocket. "It will if you come back without an invitation." He walked off without another word. I stood there long after he turned the corner, watching the shadows stretch across the sidewalk. That night, I ran the company name through the state business registry. Nothing. I reverse image searched the logo. Stock graphic. The next morning, I brought the flyer to the board. Dana, now serving as chair, took one look and grimaced. "I had someone like this come by last week," she said. "Didn't give a name, just said he was consulting. I told him to leave. Didn't realize he was making rounds. We called every resident we could reach over the weekend. 5 had been approached. 2 had been told the HOA was under review for noncompliance. 1 was asked to sign a petition to reintroduce emergency executive authority. That phrase turned my stomach. We filed a police report, attaching the flyer and descriptions. Turns out we weren't the only neighborhood hit. 2 others across the county had similar incidents: mystery consultants, fake audits, and attempts to gather signatures under false pretenses. The sheriff's office tracked the activity to a dissolved property management firm that had once employed Dolores's cousin. He had a record, nothing violent, but a string of scams involving fake maintenance contracts and forged permits. The DA added conspiracy to defraud and attempted impersonation of a legal entity to Dolores's charges. Her appeal evaporated overnight. A week later, we received a letter from the state AG's office. It confirmed that Pine Hollow was now on a watch list, not because we'd done anything wrong, but because we'd become the gold standard of what happens when residents take back control. They wanted to use our case as part of a training series for HOA reform throughout the state. We agreed. That summer, I watched from my porch as the neighborhood transformed, not in the dramatic way it had after the trial, but in the quiet, enduring way that tells you a place is healing. The new board held monthly meetings, open to all. Decisions were made by vote, agendas were posted a week in advance, and every financial record was available with a single email request. People stopped whispering about fines and started organizing block parties. Grace rode her bike without me scanning every driveway. And the cameras I'd installed? They stayed up, but not out of fear. Out of principle. Transparency wasn't a phase. It was a lifestyle now. One evening, as the cicadas started their chorus and the porch light buzzed to life, Gary walked over with a 6-pack and a newspaper under his arm. "You see this?" he asked, dropping the paper on my porch table. The headline read, "Neighborhood Fraud Case Spurs Statewide HOA Reform Bill. They're calling it the Jennings Clause," he said. "Any HOA officer who issues financial penalties without board approval can be charged with civil fraud." I cracked open a bottle. Not a bad legacy. Gary leaned back in the chair beside mine. "You think she knows? She'll find out eventually. Might even read about it in the prison library." He chuckled. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't pushed back?" I looked out across the lawn, where the maple trees still stood tall. "I try not to." We sat there in easy silence, the kind that comes after a storm you didn't just survive, but dismantled piece by piece. And when the porch light flickered once, then glowed steady, I knew the neighborhood wasn't just safe. It was finally ours again.